Today we're going to talk about how to use restorative conversations in schools to resolve conflict and repair relationships. So what are restorative practices? Particularly in schools, that's our focus today. And restorative practices are a set of skills or more tools that you can add to your toolbox. And they create community, and they also give you ways to respond to conflict and problems when they happen. They use things like authentic dialogue, coming to understanding, and making things right. So the aim of restorative practices really is to develop community and then manage conflict and tensions by repairing harm and restoring relationships. I've developed about 6 discrete skills that would commonly be needed or used in a school setting. And this diagram sort of shows you from kind of least intense to more intense, less structure to more structure. And you would use these in different scenarios depending on what happened at the school. So one of the basic things that you do in a school implementing restorative practices would be classroom circles. The first thing that you would have all your teachers having circles and building community in those classes. Also, the next thing would be the way that we talk to each other and the way we ask questions, and that's affective language. Then we have restorative chats, and that's really often having someone facilitate the restorative questions with a student and probably a teacher or with another person. You have mediation, restorative mediation. We're familiar with that when you have mutual conflict between two people. And restorative circles, a little bit larger, bigger event happened, a larger conflict with lots of different people, a lot of different planning involved, all the way to the extreme restorative conferencing, where you would have a lot of planning involved, much more intense. An example of that would be when we had a student set a trash can on fire in a bathroom, and a teacher had to put it out, and the fire department was called, and the police were called, and we ended up having a conference with the student, his parents, a couple people from the fire department, even the police officer was there. The teacher that put out the fire came. And so it was really a circle of support for the student and how do we repair this. So there's all kinds of, from low to high level incidences that you could use some of these restorative practices. Today we're really talking about the common things that a teacher could use. So we know that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, way back from when people did their educator training, they learned in child development class that every human being has some basic needs, safety needs and belonging needs. And as you move up this pyramid, kind of this hierarchy, every day teachers are asked to operate in that self-actualization and esteem area where students can be creative and collaborative and learn. Yet when all of these other needs are not met, it makes it really difficult for kids to learn. Restorative practices really aims at that belonging, helping students feel like they belong, that they're safe relationally in a school setting. And we know from research that relationships matter. Every metric that you could think about that we care about in schools are impacted by positive relationships. That when students and teachers have positive relationships together, you're more likely to see better academic scores, higher grades, better attendance, fewer disruptive behaviors, fewer suspensions, expulsions, dropouts, things like that. And you even see a reduction in anxiety between teachers and students. We've known for a long time that students do better when they have positive relationships with their teachers, but what's becoming clearer and clearer is that teachers actually have improved well-being when they have positive relationships with their students. There was a study that looked at teacher stress, and they looked at their elevated cortisol rates, that people that are under stress have higher rates of cortisol in their system throughout the day. And what they found is when they measured the cortisol rates in students that were in classrooms with stressed out teachers, their cortisol rates were also higher. So this is actually a health issue. We need to help teachers not feel as stressed. And one of the things that we can do is help them improve their relationships with their students. And not everybody is a natural at that, particularly when you're a middle or high school teacher and you might have 150 students in the day. Restorative Practices gives you tools to use to improve those relationships. Anytime you're in a Restorative Practices training, you may see this image of the social discipline window. And this was developed by Ted Wachtel and Paul McCold. And it sort of demonstrates visually how many of us operate as educators in schools. So take, for example, along the side here, we have control. You could have low sense of control or high control in your classroom. You might be not super supportive of your students, or you might be incredibly supportive of your students. So they took these two and created kind of a quadrant that you can look at. So say you're not supportive of your students and you also don't have any control over your classroom. We would call that neglectful or not. This would be like a burned out teacher that is not wanting to be here, not interacting with the kids, doesn't seem to care, and just lets it go, right? We've seen this in movies in Hollywood. Another scenario would be someone who's really permissive, like very, very supportive, but also really low expectations of the students. That would be 4. We don't want to be there either. High control, but not very supportive, we would say it's 2. You're doing things to the kids, rather punitive. This would be someone who's very strict, okay? Another scenario that we would want the most, the quadrant of width. This person is restorative, high support and high control. So you're really looking at someone who you describe as firm but fair, tough but fun. And if you think about personally of any individual in your life that's made a difference, maybe your mentor or someone that you remember fondly that made an impact in your life, if you think about it, that person was with or restorative with you. And that's one reason they made such an impact in your life. So in Restorative Practices, we're all aiming to kind of end up in that quadrant as much as we can. Now, all of us also have a tendency to fall in one of these other categories when the chips are down or when we're stressed. So when I'm at home with my kids and I'm not happy, I start edging over into the 2 or the punitive quadrant. When I was a school social worker and things weren't going well, I kind of made excuses sometimes for the students I was working with, explaining away the issues, being very supportive, but maybe not having high enough expectations. So we're not all 100% of the time restorative, but we want to be, and we try, and we check in with ourselves, and we work toward that. So we're going to do some different exercises and learn some different ways to try to be more with. Because we know there is a kind of a philosophy in restorative practice that human beings, all of us, students included, are happier, we're more productive, more cooperative, and we're even more likely to make a change in our behavior when people in authority over us do things with us rather than to us or for us. So we all can think of examples in our workplace, in our home, where we want to be engaged in decision making, we want to be included, we want to have expectation clarity, we want a fair process to how decisions are made. And so that's a really foundational piece of restorative practices in schools as well. So when you look at these 6 skills, teachers are more likely to operate kind of toward the green, yellow area here. And classroom circles is something that's very foundational for teachers to do. This is a classroom circle in which kids sit in a circle. They take turns talking. You can use classroom circles in really about 3 different ways. One would be community building in the classroom, where you're creating bonds. You also can use community circles or classroom circles when you're doing instruction, like reviewing previously learned material. You want some sort of discussion to happen. Whoever said we needed to sit in rows and face each other's backs, right? That's not something that we need to be doing in education. And so sitting in a circle to learn is incredibly engaging. And then the last thing that you would use a classroom circle for would be to solve a problem. So I've heard of situations in which teachers will circle up the students and talk about an issue with bullying in the class, or lack of participation, or a lot of people are coming in late. you can solve a problem in a circle. Now, you cannot sit in a circle and solve a problem if you haven't already built community. So most people front load it at the beginning of the year, and most of the time maybe having a weekly circle. And then later they would be able to then respond to a problem after using a circle format. And there's lots of structures to do that, and scripts and ways to help teachers know how to do those kind of problem solving circles. Classroom circles are really beneficial because they improve your overall relationships. It creates strong bonds in your classroom. It improves teacher and student well-being because you start to get those relationships humming along. It would reduce problem behaviors for sure, increase social emotional skills. People have to learn to take turns and listen to each other, using feeling words sometimes. And there also is a certain social justice to it because we ask people all the same questions. There's sort of a predictable format. It kind of creates a peaceful classroom setting. So that would be a foundational thing that you would do in a classroom when you're implementing restorative practices. The next thing that you would look at doing is looking at affective language. And that's the way that we talk and make statements, but it's also questions that we ask. So today we're going to focus on the questions that we ask because they're very powerful, and this might be something that you've seen in restorative practices before. But when there's some sort of incident of wrongdoing, you can ask these really prescribed questions to the person that did the harm, and it would promote responsibility and ownership in that person. It would focus on the individual's needs and the needs of others, and it would increase cooperation, collaboration, and provide a way to repair harm and restore relationships. So here are the restorative questions. The first question, what happened? Right? We don't ask why, but we ask what happened. And so the student in their own words could describe what happened. What were you thinking at the time? Or I've seen, what were you thinking and feeling at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you've done and in what way? Students need a lot of assistance with that, with learning and realizing how their behavior impacted other people. And then what do you think you need to do to make things right? So you would potentially process these questions with a student so that they could think about what they did and have an opportunity to explain where they were coming from, which traditionally we haven't done. We just talk to kids and maybe we don't help them understand for themselves even why they did something. Then on the other side, and I say the other side of the card because these restorative questions are from the International Institute on Restorative Practices, and you can actually go to iirp.org and order the cards. And one side is literally question 1, and the other side is question 2. And the question 2 is for the person that was harmed. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think back about times that I've been harmed in my life and when I was younger in school, say, I don't remember anyone ever asking me anything other than what happened, right? I don't remember anyone asking me these questions like, what did you think when you realized what had happened? And what impact did this incident have on you and on others? And what's been the hardest thing for you? And what do you think needs to happen to make things right? I can remember an incident in high school when a girl stole one of my creative writing stories and turned it in as her own. And I reported it, and I never heard what happened. I just knew that I lost a whole friend group. A bunch of people just stopped talking to me entirely. That's what happened to me. I never got to face her. I never got to talk to her. And if you think about many countries' criminal justice systems, there's really not an avenue for people that were harmed to have a voice. In fact, in a lot of countries, they just have to sit there like a spectator while some sort of court proceeding is going on, as though they were an equal participant or not. It's just other people watching this thing. So it's really a much more respectful process and a harder process, indeed, because you're asking people to face each other that have had conflict and harm. So those are the questions that are the restorative questions that we use in schools all the time. So I'm going to outline some ways that you could use these in your class. So say you have a student that's being disrespectful, being really disruptive, maybe he's being rude to other students in the class. The restorative questions can be really helpful there. what you would do is you would engage your class in an activity. And this would ideally be good to teach students early on in the beginning of the year. When you're a middle or high school teacher, I think one of the best ways to do it is just to be really transparent and say, in our class, we like to handle things a certain way, and you will describe it. You might say something like, we believe in building community in our class, and there's bound to be some disagreements or issues coming up. So when that happens, we answer these questions, and you share it with them. And then you might say something like, and if you ever need to talk to me, or I need to talk to you, then we'll just step aside over here, or maybe we step outside the door, because everyone has a right to privacy. And teens really like that idea that they could talk to someone and have privacy. And when we step aside, you tell the class, I expect the rest of you to do X. And if you're an English teacher, you might have them silent read, or maybe you get them started on their projects that they're doing in science or whatever. So you would tell them explicitly what to do when you're having a private conversation, and you would ask them to do that. So you would engage people in an activity, and then you would pull the student aside privately. You need to really be sure there's not an audience for this conversation. It will not go well if you have an audience. I've seen things go really sideways with that, where they start acting like a clown, or they get more belligerent, or it escalates because there are other students present. So if you need to step in the hallway, if you have a class that you can trust to do that, great. And then you would just use the restorative questions to walk you through. Now, we do have something, and this comes from the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Research, PBIS, where they talk about the 2-minute rule. If you have an issue in your class, and that conversation is going to take more than 2-3 minutes, and this can be really very quick, most likely, if the student is not complying with you in that, it's not going well, they keep arguing back, or they're not accepting responsibility, they're clearly upset, you would actually put time out. We're not going to keep doing this track. We need to talk about this at a different time. First of all, the main reason is, you need to be teaching. So you can't be spending 10, 15 minutes talking to a student in the hall. Most likely that's not going to work unless you have someone else monitoring your class. But more importantly, the chances of that student calming down in that moment, if they're that escalated that you're being really reasonable and calm and they can't calm down, then they're telling you that it's not about now, it's not about here, it's not about you, there's something else going on. And you're not going to get to the bottom of that during math class. So you just say, time out, we're going to set up a different time to talk. And so you would, again, use these questions, but in a different time, different place. Maybe it's passing period, or maybe it's lunch, or at a break time, or after school. And the other thing you can do, so you could either, after the 2-minute rule, decide to delay, but you also could get another staff member involved that they would help the student process that question. In the US, a lot of kids will have, instead of going to the office, the teacher can call and someone can come to the room and pick the student up and walk around a little bit, go through the restorative questions until they're calm and they've processed. We call this a restorative chat. And then reintroduce the student back to class and do a little bit of repair with the teacher or with whoever needs to happen. So that's an alternative too. But right now we're really talking about what can you, as a teacher, manage yourself. And these restorative questions are very powerful for that and very helpful. So we just finished talking about how you could use affective language like questions in your class and kind of start doing like a restorative chat process. And so that was what we just discussed. And now we're going to talk about restorative mediation. What do you do when you have two students in mutual conflict? So restorative mediation is actually a process you're going to use to resolve conflict between two people, and it's mutual. So harm on both sides. So we're not talking about bullying. We're not talking about someone stealing or harming someone else. We're talking about something that's fairly mutual. Often in schools, what happens is you get a report that someone's being bullied, or they feel they're being bullied, or oh, he did this to me. And then as you dig and you dig, you find out, okay, well, there was two sides of this. Two people were involved. If we rewind to the beginning, there were two people. They both did something that wasn't great, that damaged the relationship. And then as time passed, things got worse. that's almost always what it is in schools. And so mediation, even though it's not necessarily a purist view of what restorative practices is, I believe that we can do it in a restorative way. It's really different than conflict mediation or like a legal kind of mediation where you're like negotiating outcomes and who gets the assets and things like that. What we're focusing on in a restorative mediation is how are people impacted and what was the harm. It's a little bit of a different focus there. But it's something that we use all the time in schools. So that is essentially what a restorative mediation is. So we're focusing on each person's met or unmet needs, how both people were impacted. They're going to be cooperating, they're going to be collaborating a little bit, and then we're going to look at repairing harm to restore those relationships. So these are a little different than the restorative questions in that purist sense, because the way you do a mediation is you just take the same restorative questions, maybe a little simplified, and you ask each person in turn, and then you ask them to rephrase or repeat back what the other person said. So it might be as simple as person A, Abigail, tell us what happened in your words. Person B, Bianca, can you repeat back what Abigail said? And then you change it, and then you say, well, Bianca, in your words, what happened? Now, Abigail, your turn. Can you repeat back what she said? Now, you'll have to be on it because they tend to like to interrupt each other until they're sure you mean what you said with following the guidelines of not interrupting and taking turns. And you'll have to establish that early on. And I actually have a nice script that you can download from my website at lauramoyman.com. And it's in my resources section. So a nice script for how to both prepare for one of these meetings and also how to just run a mediation in that way. So you ask both people the questions, ask them to rephrase, and essentially what you're trying to do in a mediation is you're taking two distinct narratives and you're trying to bring them together to one. Because right now they're only thinking of their side, and what we want to do is have them each consider that there were two sides and there might be one full story. So that's how mediations work, and classroom teachers might end up getting involved in doing things like that, which is fantastic if they want to. And then at the end of a mediation, what you do, remember that question that you ask, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? You actually would generate a plan and write it down. And then both people would look at it, agree to it, and then most importantly is you need to agree on a follow-up date and visit again. I can tell you I've worked for school districts that have had really difficult things happen, and they've handled it beautifully and done all these lovely restorative processes, and they forgot the last step of checking back, and they didn't find out that the problem happened again, or it persisted, or it turned into like a horrible bullying situation. And we've had situations of schools getting sued, students having to leave the school, and you don't want that. So it's really as simple as, when are we going to talk about that again? Like 1 week, 2 weeks. And having them talk about, what is this going to look like from now on? And making those agreements. So that's really powerful. If you would like more information about this, go to lauramoyman.com, and I have lots of free resources that you can download. And also you can reach out if you're interested in having live training for your school and even live webinars. Thanks.